let's start with the Raiders. That's right. Let's start with the Raiders. Last night was Hard Knocks, and it gave us a little bit, like just a taste, just a little nibble of the mess that is Antonio Brown so far. We'll have the director of Hard Knocks in the last hour of the show. So we'll ask him how much of this is what they knew and how much of it did they cut because the team asked them to cut it, and how much of it was, look, they just didn't know, and all this stuff was going on behind the scenes. But I'm fascinated by what this actually means to the team, right, where he's still not a full go. And then you factor in the stories that he's not been engaged in meetings, that he's not as good a leader as some would want you to believe. You know, it doesn't work out. The whole thing with Antonio Brown is, man, when he gets out there, he works out so hard. And the stories this weekend were like, yeah, not really so much. Not even all that much. Actually, he's kind of been a jerk. Yeah. And even if he runs hard when he's running routes or when he's working out, part of being, you know, the highest paid receiver in the room and learning a new offense is totally buying into the team and helping everybody out and understanding where you're supposed to be and why you're supposed to be. They're not just having meetings to have meetings. I worked at a place once that had meetings to have meetings. It wasn't fun. But even those meetings you have to engage in. You have to engage in. But I heard this part of Hard Knocks. Stick with me for a second. I said this Friday in the herd. And Raider fans came at me on Twitter like, you don't know anything. Watch Hard Knocks. It doesn't, like, I actually have. I've talked to people. I understand what they're trying to do here. Remember, Antonio Brown's contract is essentially a 2-year deal. They had to trade for him. They offered him a bigger deal than probably they had to. But in their mind, they did not have the weaponry last year. Matter of fact, this was Lincoln Kennedy. Earlier today in the herd talking about last year as opposed to this year.
The fact is that the money they would have to pay to keep Khalil Mack, they went out and they got Antonio Brown and Trent Brown, just to name two. And it addressed the need. They needed speed at the wide receiver because they didn't have depth. But they went out and they addressed the right tackle. You know, last year, Derek Carr took his licks because he had two rookie tackles on both sides, especially in that division.
Yeah, so they went out and they said, look, we're not that good, and in order to keep the guys we have, we're going to have to overspend, so let's get rid of the guys we have, get more assets, and try and put better players around Derek Carr. It's interesting. So I'm watching Hard Knocks, and what I said Friday was, like, look, the Antonio Brown thing is frustrating, but it's most frustrating because you brought in 2 new wide receivers, a number 1 and a number 2, in an effort to see, what do I got from Derek Carr? Last year was not great, but he consistently answered the bell and has shown the desire to be a leader and worked and appears to be having a good camp. But all of that doesn't matter if he cannot improve and evolve and mature and become a franchise quarterback with the likes of Tyrell Williams and Antonio Brown. And we have no idea because we haven't seen Antonio Brown enough. Here's Jon Gruden with the broadcast crew, Brent Musburg and the broadcast crew, before the preseason game. Listen to what he has to say.
We said, how do we get Derek Carr to be a blue-chip quarterback? Well, let's get him some targets. You know, let's go get Tyrell Williams in free agency, and let's hope we can get Antonio Brown.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, they didn't think he was a blue-chip quarterback unless he was surrounded by blue-chip players, which is the opposite of what blue-chip quarterbacks are supposed to do. Blue-chip quarterbacks are supposed to raise up the level of the talent around him, the Tom Brady's. I mean, Tom Brady's obviously, but I mean, you could say the same thing about Drew Brees, Aaron Rodgers, Phillip Rivers. You know, is Keenan Allen that good, or does Phillip Rivers make Keenan Allen that good? But Antonio Brown couldn't run. I mean, Antonio Gates couldn't run the last 7 years he's with the Chargers, but somehow he had a guy who threw it to just the right spot where a guy who could not outrun any linebackers was just open enough. I mean, Andrew Luck in his career, look at who he's been surrounded by and the number of wins that he's had. The true blue chippers, you're starting to describe Derek Carr like he's Dak Prescott. Is he a good quarterback? Yeah, but he's a really good quarterback if he has really good players around him. So, I mean, Andy Dalton, same thing. So it's fair to say that they all do work in concert, but it's also fair to say that one of the big frustrations, and there's a bunch, Antonio Brown's an offensive guy, Jon Gruden's an offensive guy, Antonio Brown was the big move they made, and his off-the-field nonsense, locker room nonsense was one of the things that kind of got him run out of Pittsburgh. Like, there's a multitude of reasons that they're ticked and disappointed, and it's caused it to be a circus, and now there's the helmet and all this stupidity. But the biggest part was, hey, we're trying to spend this year evaluating whether or not Derek Carr gets to go to Vegas. His contract's essentially up at the end of the season. They can get out of the Derek Carr business. They choose to not try to get into the Kyler Murray business. But we'll see. Like, there's Tua. There's other quality quarterbacks, the kid at Oregon. And so there are options out there for the Raiders, especially with multiple first-round picks, if they decide to move on from Derek Carr, but they can't decide until they see him with Antonio Brown. And guess what? They haven't seen him with Antonio Brown. Are they frustrated? Yes. Do they have every right to be? You're damn right. And the most interesting and probably salacious story is Antonio Brown. But the real story is Derek Carr, right? Like, you're not going to win unless you have a blue chip quarterback with the Raiders. Like, they put a ton into him, unless he's good enough. And while they don't think he's good enough on his own, they're hopeful he can be good enough when surrounded by elite level talent, but they won't know until that elite level talent heals their feet and figures out what bonnet they want to wear on Sundays at Oakland Alameda.
Hi, I'm Doug Gottlieb from Fox Sports Radio, and you need to subscribe to the Fox Sports Radio YouTube channel where you can hear and see me. Why not? Plus, everybody else who's awesome here in Fox Sports Radio.